The second problem with growth is to ask, if growth doesn't lead to happiness, then is growth actually a good thing? And what you're seeing on the slide in front of you is a new science of measurement around happiness, around well-being, around thriving, around flourishing, that's aiming to show that growth is not what it has been made out to be. And this is data from the United States of America, but very soon it's going to apply to large tracts of the world. And what you're seeing is a clear departure of the measures of economic growth, GDP being the most common one among them, and a new set of measures that collectively are called GPI, or Genuine Progress Indicator. And I'll tell you a little bit about how GPI measurements are different from GDP. No measurement in the GDP calculation to account for this undesirable activity. So you're basically adding up all the positives that come out of economic growth and calling it GDP. But if something bad happens, like an oil spill, for example, there is no mechanism in GDP calculations to account for that. This is what economists famously call externalities, and sort of just wish it away. But you can see a lot of the problems that we're experiencing in the world today are actually because of these externalities. So the question becomes, what good is growth if it doesn't lead to happiness? And there's a whole science of measuring happiness that's proving this point to us. Moving on to another problem that's associated with growth. Next slide, please.
Yeah, done.
Is the idea of around growth has consequences that we're also ignoring. The most famous one is captured in the slide before you. It's a calculation by an NGO that calls itself the World Footprint Network. It gives you a good idea of what they do. And to bring this topic of overconsumption to our attention, they created this day called World Overshoot Day. Yeah? And the idea behind Overshoot Day is very simple. It demarcates the day during the year when we already use up the amount of resources that the Earth can sustainably regenerate. So this year, the day fell on August 8th or August 9th. So by August 9th, humanity as a whole has already used up what the Earth can give us sustainably in a year. And if you notice on the slide, that day has been advancing. It started off somewhere in September a few years ago, and now we're withdrawing all that the Earth has to offer sustainably by August 9th. So that means the rest of our consumption as humanity is living on borrowed time, which leads to a lot of unsustainability in the world. So I hope I've at least planted the seeds in your mind of ways to question growth, if growth is actually such a good thing. And if you move to the next slide, you see that this notion of growth as an ideal is not just the only problem. The problem behind that is also all of our notions of technical progress and science have become attached to this notion of growth, and we're committing unspeakable violence against each other, against the environment, and against a lot of what you might call spiritual notions of what is a good life. The modern lifestyle is completely at violent odds with all of these previous conceptions of a good life. I chose one example that may be particularly relevant to our situation in India, which is the much ballyhooed green revolution, which those of you who study this in the long term will have concluded that it's an unmitigated disaster, economically, politically, and also ecologically. And I'll give you one simple factoid to tell you how harmful the Green Revolution is and how is it based on violence. Because very simply put, for those of you who are chemical engineers, for example, what we used to call war chemicals during World War II and even during Vietnam are exactly the same chemicals that are now part of our food supply. So in a lot of ways, the Green Revolution is this idea of scientifically and technologically making agriculture more efficient, has brought in what we previously used to call war chemicals on an industrial scale into our food systems. So a lot of the pesticides, a lot of herbicides and fungicides, a lot of the technology behind genetically modifying things are all tied to this notion of committing unspeakable violence against nature. Yeah? So that's one idea of science and technology that we have that's directed towards growth. But if you move to the next slide, here's an inspiring example, and maybe this is where we make the turn towards rethinking or redefining progress and how does science and technology work. It doesn't have to be this way. Revolutions don't have to be based on violence. They can also be based on love and inspiration. And what you have before you is the result of a technological advance created by a startup, people working out of MIT. The name of the startup is Wiki Pearl. Pearl as in the jewel pearl, Wiki as in Wikipedia. And what they're trying to do is very much inspired by how nature does packaging. So if you look at a grape, if you look at a banana peel or a grape skin, it's fantastic examples of technical advances in nature that have to do with less wasteful packaging, not using plastic that ends up in the oceans. And this is a startup that's doing edible packaging directly inspired by these examples from nature. So they are technologically advanced, they're using cutting edge science, but their mindset is very different from the mindset that caused the Green Revolution. So I wanted to juxtapose these examples that also involve science and tech, but are coming at it very different point of view. So